Louise is a senior extension associate in the Department of Natural Resources, where she's worked for 25 years, I guess, on systems of natural resource management. Things like agroforestry, community-based protected area management, local level land use planning, and eco-agriculture. Between 1993 and the year 2003, Louise was affiliated with CPAD, Cornell International Institute for Food Agriculture and Development, and simultaneously she was a senior scientist with CFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research, and she occupied that scientist role with CFOR here at Cornell, so she was based at Cornell. Also based in Cornell, she's been occupying a role with EcoAgriculture Partners, Washington, D.C. based organization as a program director. She's been doing that since 2004, and that work continues today. Prior to coming to Cornell, she lived in Nairobi, Kenya for 10 years, and working mainly with ICRAF, now World Agroforestry Center, and CARE in Eastern and Southern Africa. And she also lived and worked for a year in Indonesia, I guess also working with CARE, okay. Louise's undergraduate degree is from the University of Colorado, although she is a New Yorker, New York Stater, I shouldn't say New York Stater, where she majored in outdoor recreation, sociology, and psychology. Her master's degree is from Colorado State, where she studied natural resource planning and management, rural sociology and politics, political science. And her PhD is from Cornell in natural resources, development sociology, and adult education. So she's been working at the intersection of disciplines for a long, long time. So thanks, Louise, for being here.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure and privilege to have a chance to tell part of my story that I've been working on for, well, since 2004 here at Cornell. And so I was asked to kind of do a retrospective. That's been a theme through this particular semester. We've had a number of speakers who, gave us talks maybe 10 years ago or so, or more than 5 years ago, between 5 and 10, and we're kind of doing updates. So this is a chance for me to do a little updating on where we are with eco-agriculture. So the title, From Eco-Agriculture to Scaling Up Integrated Landscape Management, will be told in 4 parts. So we begin with eco-agriculture and the Cornell Eco-Agriculture Working Group. Then we go into Integrated Landscape Management and Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature initiative. And then I try to digest some of what we've been learning as we've moved through eco-agriculture into ILM, and then ask the question about what's next, where are we going with this? So back in 2003, Dr. Sarah Shear and Dr. Jeff McNeely got together to write this book. I just wanted to, since I'm an extension educator, I like props. I'm an old school educator. And this is one of my favorite props. It's a copy of an Island Press publication that came out in 2003 called Strategies to Feed the World and Save Wild Biodiversity by Sarah and Jeff. Sarah, at the time that she and Jeff wrote this book together, was a agricultural economist at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. And she had been pulled out of IFPRI to contribute to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which brought us the Millennium Development Goals a little bit later. But before the Millennium Development Goals arose, there was a global-wide study to look at the state of the planet and natural resources and agriculture and livelihoods on the planet. And Sarah got paired up with Jeff McNeely, who was the chief conservation scientist at the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, IUCN. And lo and behold, when they looked at these global planetary scale maps, which are relatively new in those days, and they recognized that her interest in smallholder agriculture and his interest in protected area management butted right up against each other with respect to land use. And they realized that most of the protected areas, and certainly all of them, virtually all of those that had been designated for future protected area status, which Jeff was in charge of worldwide, they were full of agriculture practitioners and agricultural land use. And they went, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? So they said, well, they both had ideas about this, and they set about collecting as many little case studies and examples of places where agricultural land use and conservation land use were not necessarily in conflict, where there was some overlap, where there were some synergies, and they wrote this book. So the book, like I said, was published by Island Press. It got a lot of notoriety. It got really a lot of attention. They sold way more copies than they thought there were. There was a hunger for this. However, as soon as the senior scientists in the CGIAR system, the Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research Organizations, which Sarah had worked for many years for ECROF before she went to IFPRI, so she was in the center of the CG system, it was critiqued like crazy. I mean, there's no science behind that. This is, nonsense. There's no evidence. Island Press, who are they? That's just popular stuff. It's all anecdotal. There's nothing to it. So Sarah and Jeff came to Cornell. Sarah had gotten her degree here in agricultural economics. They came to Cornell, and they knew I was here, and they knew Jim Lasoy and some Norman Uphoff, a lot people who were kind of allied to their interests and were really into this integration thing already. And they said, we need evidence that this is real, that this eco-agriculture idea is real, that you can have your cake and eat it too. And so they got some money from USAID, had a little bit of money. Let me just need to get, so anyway, I'm going to go back one step. Right in 2004, as that book was coming out and gaining notoriety, Jeff and Sarah formed EcoAgriculture Partners. She was the CEO and president, she was the leader, and he was the chair of the board of directors. And they said, since they started really believing in this stuff and really had a passion for it, and they hadn't quit their day jobs yet, they were still working for IFPRI and IUCN respectively, but they started this little startup NGO in Washington, D.C. And they said, let's try to make this happen. And we recognized that we need partnership to do it. So they came up with the name EcoAg Partners. They couldn't do it alone, but they were going to bring together all their allies that could help operationalize this concept. So then they came to us as EcoAg Partners and said, Cornell, help us demonstrate that there's some kind of a scientific basis behind this concept. So this was, while CFAD under Norman Uphoff was still very active in stimulating and forging these ideas about integration for sustainability across land uses, across institutions, across disciplines and so on. So a number of faculty picked up the charge, mobilized some of their postdocs and graduate students, and we conducted this study called A Review and Assessment of the Scientific Foundations. So we presented it to USAID. They were really happy with it. They asked us to make sure that it got into the press. So they had us, they sponsored this book that followed up called Farming with Nature, The Science and Practice of Eco-Agriculture. And the first chapter in there is a synthesis of this study. And we're saying, yeah, this is real, it's a thing, it's got a scientific foundation, so let's get on with it. So that's what we started to do. One of the really cool things for me that came out of collaborating with this initial group of Cornell faculty who were involved in this, very cross-disciplinary group, was Norman Uphoff saying, well, this is great, he's very wordy and he's very articulate, but he would page after page, explaining all this stuff. We said, we just need to get it across more easily. So he actually came up with the three-legged stool. He sat there and doodled, and we all pontificated, and that became a really important sort of logo for EcoAg Partners for a long time when we were trying to explain it to practitioners. And so we have the stool and we have the puzzle. And so basically the idea is that you've got the egg production, the biodiversity conservation, and the local livelihood security glued together through supportive, collaborating, coordinated institutions. Institutions that have the capacity to mobilize and to research and to learn and to move this idea into practice. So, thus beginneth the Cornell EcoAgriculture Working Group. And the last few pages of this thing are lists of faculty and grad students who contributed. We had like 38 different members of the CFAD/Cornell community contribute to this thing. It was really quite amazing. We did lots of desk research, we call it, lots of literature and reviews and so on, but we also consulted many scientists and senior practitioners from organizations all around the world, and all of those are listed here. So we began, really building up this network of allied thinkers by doing that study. So the Cornell EcoAg Working Group remains today it's a very loose association, a loose network. I mean, it's a place where you can come and engage in ecoagriculture related activities. But it doesn't have, meetings per se, and it doesn't have a charter or anything. It's just like, if back in the day, CFAD was organized around working groups, I happened to be involved with the agroforestry working group in those days, and with the protected area management working group and the local land use planning working group. So all these came together for me in the EcoAg working group. So it was more like one-stop shopping. Okay, so now we've got it legitimized. But we still don't really know what it is. In other words, we don't know an ecoagriculture landscape when we see one. How does an ecoag landscape function differently than another landscape? And how do we know that it's getting more ecoag-like, in other words, delivering conservation, production, and livelihood security goals as we invest in activities to try to realize those goals? So again, the working group mobilized. This time, Professor Tom Gavin, who was a conservation biologist type in Department of Natural Resources, he's now emeritus, he's still with us, still active in some ways. So he and myself and a couple of very ambitious graduate students got together to develop a framework. Again, this was, EcoAg Partners contracted us to do that. They found the money, they mobilized the money from Washington, D.C., where there's a lot more money to be had for this kind of stuff than there is in conventional pathways for financing academic work. So we got this, we spent over a year and a half. We spent a year and a half with a similar methodology. We brought together working groups, but these were basic Washington, D.C. based meetings of experts, expert consultants, to ask the question, what would you need to know to convince you that the promise of an ecoagriculture landscape is being delivered? And out of that came a framework of 20 different criteria for assessing the performance of an ecoagriculture landscape. So related to each of our 4 goals, we had 5 different performance criteria. And so that got a lot of attention, not only by the people who contributed to, but people in the field started asking for us to help support the development of their landscape initiatives with use of this framework. So then I worked with Cooperative Extension over in Roberts Hall, in particular Paul Treadwell, and we developed the Landscape Measures Resource Center, which was a tool to operationalize this framework so that landscape practitioners could figure out how to set up monitoring and systems in their programs that would generate information to support management. We recognized the shortfalls of project level M&E, and we recognize that landscape management is a long-term prospect, so we need to have a measurement and system that supports management over the long term. So this was a dynamic online tool that basically helped guide practitioners through looking at performance criteria, then finding appropriate indicators for them, and then means of measuring those indicators that would bring stakeholders in the landscape together to add their judgment to the measures. And we turned it into a scoring tool. And so the directions for how to use it as a scoring tool are in the LMRC. And we still use this in a lot of our training and a lot of our assistance to local landscape initiatives when they're trying to get up and running. We say, well, let's see how your landscape's doing already. And this is a really good conversation starter, this scoring tool. So a related axis of development was to invest in landscape leadership. We were partnering with University of California at Berkeley, who had an environmental leadership program, and we brought one of the leaders of that program into our sphere, and she taught us how to evaluate different leadership styles and qualities and characteristics using Myers-Briggs type stuff. And then we, the idea being that a landscape initiative is going to need multiple sources of leadership, and you're going to want to get leadership teams together. So how do you design your leadership teams in ways that you get different personality types, but most important, leaders with different leadership qualities and characteristics all working in harmony? So we developed a strategy for having week to 10-day long leadership courses, and we would identify colleagues. This was mostly taking place in Africa at this time. Colleagues in Africa who would nominate potential people to take these courses. And during the course of the courses, they would form pretty strong leadership networks, and they actually ended up with EcoAgriculture working groups in many communities across Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania and a few in Ethiopia in those days. So then we decided we needed some sort of a more coherent theory about what we expected these landscape leaders to do. How are they meant to stimulate the kind of innovation that would lead to these complex socio-ecological landscapes actually working? So we stepped back and asked ourselves, what's really going on here with regard to getting people to work together? Working together on its own isn't enough. What's the desired outcome? And we came up with this kind of what we call innovation theory. And the idea is that if you get, whoops, I'm sorry. Let's see. All of these different bubbles aligned, then you get landscape innovation. And innovation is the capacity of the actors in the landscape to learn to adapt to changing risks and opportunities. And it's the innovative capacity that focuses on the practice. And the practice is adaptive, collaborative management of landscapes. It's people working together. And learning together, that's the social learning through a whole range of different ways of doing things. The focus of this is on the facilitation to support the learning. This is what the leaders in the landscapes are doing. They're catalyzing, convening, conceptualizing, negotiating. In other words, they're not just training. This was the key point we were trying to bring across. These landscape facilitators, these leaders, were not out there to train people how to do things. They were there to mobilize action in a concerted way that would actually, as they're acting, they'd be generating the knowledge and synthesizing it through conversation and documentation that they would need to then take the next steps for action. So this reflexive learning process that a lot of us talk about as social learning. That's the core concept behind all of the activity that occurs in these landscapes. And so that we wrote that up in a chapter for a book on the science and practice of adaptive management in agricultural and natural resources. That was published. It was led by a group at Virginia Tech. And they were coming, so some of you old hands here who remember the SANREM program, they were linked to SANREM, and they were really enamored with this idea of adaptive management, and we threw in the adaptive collaborative management, and they really liked that a lot. So they produced a book as a synthesis of some of their work, and this theory of change, if you will, was the first chapter in the book. So it was started getting some traction. Another axis of development of this idea of eco-agriculture is synthesized in the World Watch State of the World report. They came out with a special issue called Innovations That Nourish the Planet. And they invited me and Sarah Shear, the head of EcoAgriculture Partners, to contribute the lead chapter on mainstreaming eco-agriculture. So again, I came to Cornell and I got a couple of students to help me interview all the faculty who I knew here who were allied or knew something about agroecological approaches to, and who could help legitimize it. So SRI is in there, for example. Norman, I interviewed Norman extensively. A lot of Peter Hobbs's work. There's many faculty members around, and they were also, a lot of them were part of our initial group. But this was kind of like the hardcore agricultural practices. Now, I'm not trying to say that eco-agriculture or integrated landscape management depends solely on agroecological practices, but it's certainly an important piece of it. And so that helped get that idea out, having that. And then around the same time, we hired somebody who could make some renderings of landscapes to kind of illustrate these things. They've also been a useful communication and visualization tool. We have 4 of these to show dry landscapes, to show ridge to reef seascapes, and different kinds of context for eco-agriculture. So another axis of development was in higher education. And so I had the privilege of working with Jim Lasoy and a group called Habitat 7, which is an independent consulting group who specializes in information communication technology, who's based out of up in Canada, and EcoAgriculture Partners, UC Berkeley. And Jim was successful with some help in getting a USDA Higher Education Challenge grant that allowed us to work in some of these landscapes that we've been piloting and pioneering and advancing the concept and the practice. Work with practitioners in those landscapes to bring landscape thinking and practice into the classroom, and to engage students in helping practitioners advance their practice through the kind of research that you can sit here at Cornell University and do. None of these folks in the landscapes have access to the Cornell University library system. And so we were able to mobilize a tremendous amount of, we would conduct classes, and there were various classes that Jim and others were teaching at the time, that we would get the students linked up with practitioners in the field. The practitioners in the field would ask questions that they couldn't answer on their own, that they thought a Cornell University team could help them answer. And the student teams would spend the whole semester answering those questions. Our first take on it was, oh, well, they need a research paper, to help verify what they're doing. We quickly learned that's not what they needed. They needed all kinds of knowledge products. They needed proposals written. They needed communication, brochures developed. We finally got really, open as we said, we'll give you whatever you want. We will help you advance your, whatever you ask for. If we've got the talent in our pool of students and with the faculty that were supporting these classes, we'll give you what you want. It became a very interesting, very popular kind of two-way educational kind of thing. It took, as you might imagine, enormous amounts of mentoring and just really kind of beyond what we were able to sustain. And so it's now kind of happening on a very low-key basis. But at least I think we got to the point of proof of concept. And if you get an ambitious faculty member who's willing to do all of that, mentoring and hand-holding and keeping the practitioners happy and the students happy and everybody feel like they're getting something out of it, I think it's still a very valid concept. I'd like to see it go further. Okay, so we're moving along with this eco-agriculture idea. It's really getting a lot of traction, among practitioners and the education and research community. certainly NGOs are picking up on it like crazy, and it becomes kind of a really popular way to do development programming. The World Bank's funding it. A lot of the funding for the things I've just talked to you about coming from different UN agencies and bilateral donor aid agencies, some foundations. And as it got more popular, though, we started realizing that there was some quarreling going on about terminology, as there is in any kind of new field. And a lot of time is spent when a new field is emerging, or any kind of new major concept, of defining terms and staking out your territory, if you will. So we realized that we didn't want to be in a space where we were fighting for the right to keep eco-agriculture, you know, the main term for this integrated landscape management kind of thing. And so we started documenting how many different terms there are and who are the people that are carrying these terms forward. For example, the most overlapping one is integrated watershed management. But there's very important differences between integrated landscape management and integrated watershed management. And that's just one of many. So we started more systematically documenting all the analogous systems. And we came up with a list of 60. And we decided to address it straight on and say, listen, folks, we've got all these different things going on. We need to make progress. We're all in this to try to solve the problem. We're not in here to stake out, you know, territory. So let's figure out what we're going to call it. And let's figure out what the common elements of what we're all doing are. And so then a paper called, it was written for policy makers. It was a policy brief that EcoAgriculture Partners developed, where they, in this 4-page policy brief, the 60 analogous systems are listed. And we said, this is what we think is the synthesis across all of this. It was done through lots of interviewing, lots of interaction with beholders of the different systems. And we came up with these 5 key features. And after tossing some ideas around, the concept of integrated landscape management seemed to encompass all of them. It hadn't already been usurped by any one of these analogous systems. It wasn't in widespread use. It resonated a lot with integrated watershed management, which people recognize as being multidisciplinary, multi-land use, and so on. So we threw it out there and said, how about this? Does ILM work? And so it caught hold. It did work. And from then on, we actually were able to construct a coherent definition of what an integrated landscape is. It took a good year or more of collaboration and going back and forth and different papers and different meetings and so on. But ultimately, this is the definition that many members of the international or integrated landscape management field or movement, if you will, use. It's not very controversial. It's a nice kind of generic. But the key thing is it's a socio-ecological system. And that resonates with terminology that's in widespread practice in academia. And then we came up with a definition for integrated landscape management, long-term collaboration among different groups of land managers and stakeholders to realize multiple objectives in a sustainable landscape. And then we came up, again, through this collaborative process with lots of different partners of a kind of a coherent planning process for stimulating the development of integrated landscape initiatives. And so this is fairly common thinking of, for people who are into adaptive collaborative management. Nothing really startling here, but in the writings about this, we detail what happens at each of those stages and what the roles of different leaders are. And so there's been a lot of writing on this simple concept. So as there started to be some coherence and some sort of gelling around this concept, we realized a lot of people wanted to get on board and start moving in the same direction. And we've got, even when Sarah and Jeff wrote this book, it was based on anecdotal evidence, but it was real people in real landscapes really doing real things. Well, now we had proliferated our examples of real people in real landscapes doing real things in a more coherent, purposeful way. manyfold. And so we said, well, let's start thinking about how we scale this stuff up. In other words, let's not have a whole bunch of little initiatives here, there, and everywhere that don't add up to something. So we launched the Global Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature initiative at a meeting in Nairobi at ECROF in 2013. 130 representatives of organizations who were kind of buying into this idea and had the resources to get themselves to Nairobi for 3 days, came together and developed a structure that had 9 so-called co-organizers. These are the co-organizing organizations. It's a real hodgepodge of types of organizations. Notice the Ministry of Economic Affairs for the government of Netherlands. They were really important partners. They provided a lot of the funding to keep this thing going. All the co-organizers, and Conservation International was an original one, they all contributed financially in the early days. Some dropped out later. But in addition to this, we had 70 so-called strategic partners that all allied with what we were doing. So all the documentation that we had to produce and our strategic plan for how we would form working groups and how we would work had to be approved by everybody. So it's quite an interesting consensus finding process. But the interesting thing was it did work. In other words, there was enough interest in this that people can just drop out if they don't want to buy in. But people not only kept buying in, but more and more people joined this LPFN. So what did we do in the LPFN? We did a whole lot of things. I can't talk about them all here, but one of the key things that interested me most, that I was most involved in, is developing these learning landscape networks. As I talked to you before, leadership in networks and these social actor-based innovation systems were something that I really wanted to learn more about, how we could connect up all these leaders to start making a difference. So we developed a lot of learning landscapes, and that meant we found ways to get small pools of funding into these landscapes and let the people who were stimulating local landscape initiatives be the primary decision makers about how that money would be used to stimulate innovation. It could either be in changing a land use system, bringing a researcher in to improve a particular agroecological practice or any agricultural practice, bringing in other experts on marketing. Marketing was a really big piece of this. How do you develop the market systems that incentivize smallholder agricultural producers to invest in production practices that are that deliver ecological benefits as well, that kind of thing. So all of these learning landscapes had a different sort of priority, and so we would have a little competitive fundraising activity with them, get some small mini grants in there, do some things, and then bring them all together in some kind of a common place, do some convening, some sharing, integrate what they were learning with policy dialogues that we would stimulate at a higher level. So we were trying to get the policy and the practice more aligned by having learning activities linked with policy dialogues. And again, we mobilized some activity, but hard to say, what the real impact was, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So, and to complement the investment, sort of the deep dives in particular learning landscapes, we decided in the LPFN to take a broader overview look, as well as wonder how many of these initiatives recognize that they're initiatives and would be able to sort of self-evaluate how they're doing according to some criteria that we put out there. So we commissioned a series, or a collection, I should say, of 4 studies that were done in four continents to ask the question of, what are you doing that you're calling integrated landscape management? What are your successes? What are your benefits, and so on? And so I just put not the names of the articles, but just the names of the authors and the journals that they're in. And of course, all this stuff is on the EcoAg website or the LPFN website, if you want to look those up. But they're pretty interesting studies. And this is just a quick example of the fact that we've used the data from those studies for many different purposes, in terms of convincing skeptics about whether there's really landscape initiatives out there that are trying to work across all 4 dimensions or all 4 axes. For fundraising, and the latest use we put these to is there's a lot of discussion now among entities that are responsible with implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of thought is being given to how you could use ILM to help implement SDGs, multiple SDGs in one place in a relatively short period of time. So this was used just to show how SDG numbers on the right link to some of these self-reported impacts. So in addition to those 2 things, the learning landscapes and the stock taking of landscape initiatives around the world, we did what the LPFN called a global review of the state of knowledge. So many studies on lots of different dimensions, lots of different factors that were predicted to, hypothesized to affect the success of integrated landscape management, and lots of contexts in which ILM might be practiced. And when we started doing that, we realized that rural continuum became a really important place of interest to apply ILM. So we quit thinking about ILM as just a rural kind of land use strategy. No, it's really about optimizing land uses across the whole spectrum of them, including housing and transportation and energy and all the rest of it. When you make the tent much bigger, you get mining under the tent and all kinds of land uses that are much trickier to deal with than just smallholder agriculture and landscape mosaics. So all those studies, are not accessible to a lot of folks. They don't know how to read them, they don't know what to get out of them, they sound quite specialized. So we started getting calls for, well, how do we synthesize ILM? How can we develop a language that we can all talk that builds on this growing body of evidence? So a group came together, the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, the Sustainable Trade Initiative in the Netherlands, EcoAgriculture Partners, and the Global Canopy Program. The Global Canopy Program provided most of the money for this. And those 4 organizations got together and decided on terminology and concepts and a very detailed glossary to help guide practitioners further on what ILM was. And the reason I put the date this was published in, it was published and printed in many thousands of copies. It's this tiny little book. And it was distributed at the Global Landscape Dialogue, which was a side event of the Climate COP, Conference of Parties on Climate Change, back in 2015, when we finally got an agreement on, and so that was a really momentous year. The year before, in 2014, there'd been a Global Landscape Dialogue that was also a side event, and 250 or 300 people had showed up. For this one, 4,000 people showed up. They were completely unprepared. And so there was nowhere near enough coffee or people to check you in or anything for the first day. And then they just brought in hordes of people to service 4,000 people who were there to talk about landscapes. And it was really the most remarkable event I've been to in all of the stuff I've done, because there was so much positive energy. Naturally, these books were flying off the shelf. We couldn't begin to, we got rid of all of them. We thought we'd have them to give away to all of our colleagues for years to come. No, they were gone. And the momentum just took off. And all of a sudden, everyone's doing landscapes. And everyone's talking about landscapes. And it's in the program for not just those of us trying to, facilitate our little thing, but it was everywhere. It was people that were definitely not part of our sphere. It was it was through osmosis that it was all about landscapes. Now and landscapes were seen as the way we were going to get climate smart agriculture, climate smart everything. So, so then the call came for tools. Oh my gosh, it's one thing to have concepts and ideas and glossaries and definitions and examples. We need to know how to do this. So we rose to the challenge of developing tools, and we've been doing a lot of work around tools since then. We have tools for monitoring and evaluation, tools for facilitating training, ground-based photo monitoring of landscape change arising from sustainable land management. These are all heavily influenced, if not led, by Cornell faculty and graduate students. They just really got mobilized, and because we had this kind of influx of new financial resources, not a lot of money, but enough to hire a grad student here and there and keep things going a bit. We were able to be very productive for a while here on tools. And so we have the Public-Private Civic Partnership for Sustainable Landscape. This is called the Convener's Guide, and it takes you through that whole landscape planning process that I talked about earlier. And step by step by step, do this, do that, do the other thing, think about this, apply this tool here, try this here. It's a hand-holding kind of exercise. But the cool thing about it, from my point of view, it was sponsored by and co-written with the international, the IDH International Trade Initiative, which brings together businesses interested in landscapes. And it's one thing to get grassroots NGOs and local governments involved in an initiative. It's a whole other thing to bring business in, as you well know. And so this starts to talk about what you need to do to demonstrate the so-called business case for investment in a sustainable landscape. We started lots of questions about governance. How do you get a multi-stakeholder platform up and running? Once you've got the platform running, how do you manage all the conflict that's inevitable in a landscape system, in terms of multiple levels of administrative influence, multiple technical sectors at the horizontal level? How do you negotiate that? How do you, common interests across all that diversity? So, we tried our best to partner with a lot of different organizations who are thinking about these things. Obviously, and we used the same approach that we used back when we were creating this and then creating the initial landscape measures framework, is this iterative process of bringing together experts, creating a set of guidelines, questions, if you will, hypotheses to stimulate conversation, trying to capture what they say, figure out where's the consensus, where's the divergence, and document, okay, this is what we know at this time, at this place, this is what we think, and get it out there. It's the learning by doing. And it's this very rapid fire, learn, monitor, synthesize, publish, and then you're on to the next. So we're all really busy. But it's really very fascinating process to engage students in, because students work fast anyway, and they have a real burning interest to make a difference. And this is kind of a set of activities where I think it's legitimate to say you're going to make a difference, at least in the long term. One of the tools I worked on here, and I engaged a lot of my colleagues in the Department of Natural Resources in the development of this Design Elements for Landscape Stewardship Partnership. And so this was published in a book that came out last year in Cambridge University Press, which is called The Science and Practice of Landscape Stewardship. So here we have the science and practice of eco-agriculture. So landscape stewardship came out 10 years later. It's almost the same thing, but it's from a European perspective, and the Europeans prioritize culture in their landscapes. So if a sustainable landscape has to solve not only for sustainable ag and ecosystem service conservation and sustainable livelihoods, it has to prioritize culture. That's the #1 outcome. And of course, they go to great lengths to define culture, but it makes it a really interesting proposition to integrate that piece. So that's who I did this for. And this is kind of a, well, I'm not going to go through it, obviously. There's many tools and many different ways to practice and so on, but it was a thoughtful piece that we now use in a lot of our trainings to help, because that's the big question. How do you form partnerships that stick? And so we build that model around lots of examples of partnerships in landscapes that are trying it this way, that way, or the other way, and saying, well, there's lots of different ways to do it. Here's what we think are some guidelines for what I would try if I was going to do it next. Similarly, these guidelines for participatory monitoring, evaluation of multi-stakeholder platforms. Same kind of approach. We legitimized the set of criteria that we chose by publishing the basis for these guidelines in environmental management first, and then the guidelines had a lot more traction, a lot more credibility. There's nothing like building the science and practice together to stimulate credibility, legitimacy, and I think a more solid foundation of knowledge. This is something that we're working on now that's really interesting. This is Zona Norte. It's the northern part of Honduras, where a lot of people in CFAD and have worked in this area before. And it's beset with oil palm, massive expansion of oil palm, as well as lots of other competing land uses in this highly important biodiverse area. So we're doing some scenario modeling there, and they have decided that they want to invest in taking all of our tools and kind of integrating them and seeing what they can do. Here's the last big tool we've worked on. Most recently, it's still in the first version. It's been pilot tested in 2 landscapes. The big question now is, how do we finance these things for the long term? Multiple sources of financing. We distinguish financing for funding the so-called enabling environment. That's building your multi-stakeholder platform, things that don't generate a return immediately. And then there's also investing in the so-called assets that will eventually generate a return. So this landscape investment and finance tool is organized around those 2 sets of investment, and we identify a whole process for figuring out how you're going to get your landscape initiative funded for 20 or more years. The main thing here is you need this coordination mechanism. There's lots of potential funding. There's lots of places on the landscape that need the funding, but it's all helter-skelter. It's everywhere. There's no coordinated action around funding whatsoever, and it's stopping progress. And so everyone recognizes until we sort out the finance and investment piece, that's why engaging business becomes so much more important now. They've got lots of money, and they are doing analyses on risk management for being able to access and source their commodities out of these landscapes. They have an interest in coming to the table often. It's a question of how do you engage them, how do you talk their language, how do you learn from them. So lots more going on. I just want to take us. Barind Tract Landscape Initiative is another landscape in Bangladesh that is trying to, wants to take all the different tools that we have and figure out how they can apply them to accelerating the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. They put this is their terminology, they put everything in their subtitle, Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and Climate Resilience through Water-Centric ILM. And that's what ILM is good for. You can get lots of different concepts under there, and therefore lots of different potential sources of funding under the tent. Right now, sort of cutting-edge activities revolve around a special topics course I did last semester with a group of students to ask the question of how do we convince purveyors of agricultural commodities to invest in practices that will yield biodiversity benefits or won't disturb biodiversity too much. So we developed a very cool tool for use by the Belgian government in trying to bring companies that are under their influence, under the influence of this tool. They're going to try to make it mandatory. Really interesting process. Right now I'm working with a group of students on to explore land governance and property rights in integrated landscape management. In addition to financing, the other big obstacle that's now recognized of really making progress is land governance and property rights. So we're trying to inventory who's doing what in that space, what are some of the innovations, create a scoping study, get it out there, get it circulated, form a network of people who are doing innovative things, and start getting some momentum going in that space too. So what are we learning? I'm just going to have 3 quick slides here. Landscape approaches are not a fad. The reason I have to say that is a paper came out published by senior scientists at C4 2 years ago that it was a scientific review article. And they reviewed some 1,000+ articles and could not find any evidence that the landscape approach works. And of course it has to do with, it's because they're looking for evidence based on conventional experimental model type studies. The studies that you would need to design to actually figure out if this approach works are very, very few people are doing them, and even fewer are trying. Some are trying to do them. Very few are being published. So what I call synthesis of current consensus studies. That's a lot of what we've been doing. Combined with surveys of practitioners can advance the theory needed to support the practice. And I give two outstanding examples. Jeff Sayre was the first Director General of C4. Before that, he worked for World Wildlife Fund and IUCN around these questions of protected area management that intersects with smallholders doing their thing on the land. And so he's been an integration guy from way back. And he led a process that I happened to be part of for several years, this consultative process of trying to figure out what is this landscape approach? What can we say about it? How do we synthesize it? And a paper was published called 10 Principles. It was published in PNAS, and it's extremely highly cited. And so it basically says that, you know, it's all about adaptive management. It's all about muddling through. It does not lend itself to the type of scientific study that the CGIAR is absolutely expert in doing. And therefore, it's going to be very general, difficult to generate evidence that this is working. Doesn't mean it's not working. It means we have to better match the science with the practice when it comes to mega-scale evaluations. Well, I want to go back one. Sayre also, I was also part of Sayre's group in 2017 on measuring the effectiveness of landscape approaches. And that was published just recently in Sustainability Science. He basically says what I just said, but much, much more coherently. He brought together a group of 17 people who work in this space. He brought us all over to Australia together and ran one of his famous Jeff Sayre workshops, and we spent a week cavorting in the rainforest and thinking hard, and came out with this paper. And that's how he does things. He goes to really beautiful places. He gets people together that he likes to work with, and he says, you know, what's happening? What have you been doing? Tell us about it. And he gets us all to stand up and give presentations and workshops. We critique each other, and then we write it up, and it gets published. And it basically is a consensus of what do we think is going on. And this, I love this paper because it gives us a way forward. I've been working on the so-called M&E of this for the last 14 years. And I'm still perplexed, but this really gives us a way forward, and it is organized around theory of change. We need to develop a very coherent, well-elaborated theory of change for each landscape initiative, and then develop the impact metrics along each of the pathways within that theory. So it's still internal, but it's got the potential to be adaptive. And then you can verify when and where and why you made the changes that are inevitable when you're shaping one of these things. And it becomes a much more compelling body of evidence about whether landscape approaches are working. So that's the current hypothesis. That's what we have to get busy figuring out, how to develop these theories of change that are coherent and that you can measure. And the promising things on the horizon are that citizen science has a very untapped role to play in helping gather evidence. So do big, mega open source data monitoring systems, land use monitoring systems like Global Forest Watch. So in other words, high technology, well designed and well placed, has an important role for advancing this. And what's next? So EcoAg Partners is now involved with Solidaridad and World Wildlife Fund and a group of Silicon Valley impact investors. Brand new stuff for us. We've never worked with impact investors before, who have a theory that if we apply all these different tools, and especially the LIFT tool, you know, this mobilizing finance, in concert, kind of like the idea that Bangladesh has, only on steroids, you know, because we aren't, the impact investors so far haven't found rural Bangladesh. The theory is that we could dramatically accelerate and scale up what they're calling regenerative landscapes. So that's where all our fundraising effort is going now, is trying to mobilize these impact investors and try to get some, you know, articulate what it is that would be different if we were able to do those. So I hope to run a special topics course on that next semester. I've been pressured by one of my students this semester and to do that, and we'll see. I haven't promised, but it would be fascinating to me to engage Cornell, not only students, but faculty in some of these questions. I don't even really know what impact investing is, but I think there's a lot to learn about it. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. Here's some more. Here's sources of all that stuff I talked about. It was all on the website. You should have just read the website. But no, we've got really all those knowledge resources and products that I talked about are there. So if you ever want to learn about and practice ILM, there's no excuse not to. Thank you, everybody.